Last week, your beloved former interim minister, Reverend Steve Edington, shared a wonderful sermon entitled, "God is Not God's Name." The sermon was based primarily on a chapter from his recently published book by the same name. And my sermon today is meant to be my response of a sort to Steve's sermon and his book. When thinking about what I might say today, I found myself remembering the words of the late Kurt Vonnegut, who actually attended a Unitarian Universalist church. Vonnegut said, "People don't come to church for preachments, of course, but to daydream about God." Today I will share 4 brief daydreams about God, in addition to the ones you've heard so far this morning in the form of poetry and poetic lyrics. Poetry might be really the best way to daydream about God. So I know this is a Unitarian Universalist congregation, of course, and I'm sure there are some people here who might not be too thrilled to daydream about God. In fact, some of you might cringe a bit, at least internally, at the word God. Some of you, I don't know, I've had the experience of people using hash marks to count the number of times a preacher says God, and only in a UU congregation.
There's an app for that.
There's an app for that. So if you're an agnostic or an atheist, maybe you're not too happy about spending the next 15 or so minutes talking about God. For the second week in a row, no less. But let me annoy you even further to say that for those of you who call yourself atheists, that's a false title. It's not possible to be an atheist. Atheism is impossible. There, I said it. I say this with the utmost affection. Remember, I was raised by humanistic Unitarian Universalists to be an atheist. It was rather fundamentally enforced in our household, in fact. And I called myself an atheist for really about the first half of my life. And I've spent many hours arguing that position. I know I've shared with you already a couple times about how I used to argue the atheist position with my old college roommates in my triple. And the Baptist roommate, and Julie and I would argue, and I'd tell her it was really foolish to believe in God. And I said, if there's a God and he wants me to believe in him, why doesn't he give me a sign? Like, why doesn't he give me a call right now? And as I told you, I picked up the phone with dramatic flourish and I say, "Hello, God?" And I got the surprise of my then short life when I heard a feminine voice say, "Lara?" And as you might remember, that feminine voice was, of course, the other college roommate, the United Methodist, Allison. Of course, what happened was that just by chance, Allison was calling up to our room at just the moment I had picked up, so without a ring, there she was. So it wasn't God, it was just Allison. And a coincidence, but maybe not, just a coincidence. I take you back to the conversations we've had about synchronicity. As a reminder, synchronicity was psychoanalyst Carl Jung's theory that there is what he called an acausal connecting principle at play in the world, in the universe. The idea that all people and all things are linked through what he called the collective unconscious. So the idea is that synchronistic events, or what seem to be like big coincidences, are really manifestations of our link through this collective unconscious. So according to this theory of synchronicity, when I picked up the phone and said, "Hello, God," and I heard Allison, it wasn't just an accident, it wasn't just chance, it was that connecting principle at play, and it was behind that little episode. So that's really the first daydream about God that I sometimes have. Maybe God is, to use Jung's term, the collective unconscious. the unseen but undeniable link between us and everything that exists. As we say in our seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Perhaps that link, that collective unconscious, that interdependent web, is God. That's just one daydream. But let's get back to the point I made, which might still be bothering some of you, that there's no such thing as atheism. Why would I say that? Because I actually feel that this is all semantics. We might all have different daydreams about God or the ultimate mystery or spirit of life, but what is God but a word to represent something that words just can't capture? The word God tries somewhat in vain to capture the mystery of our very existence. What created the universe? Even if you believe in the Big Bang Theory, there's still that question of why there's something here at all. Why is there something instead of nothing? Never mind how the universe got here. What's the point of it all? What's it all about? As much as I revere science, I don't think it's possible for science ever to answer those questions. And that's why at the end of the day, we're all here this morning instead of at some laboratory or some science symposium. I think science can teach us something about the mysteries of the universe, and cosmology is getting more and more interesting about the nature of things. But science, I don't think will ever be able to answer why. And that's exactly why Reverend Steve's book resonated for me. The title itself, which he got from the words of the late Reverend Forrest Church. Reverend Church wrote, "God is not God's name. It's a name for that which is greater than all and present in all." You know, Steve and I have landed at a very similar place theologically, even though he traveled from a very different place from his traditional evangelical Baptist path as a young person, whereas I traveled away from that, at the time, traditionally late 20th century form of UU humanism and atheism from my youth. In my now 13 or so years of UU ministry, I've been telling people that God is not God's name the whole time, but a lot less succinctly. So let me throw a few more words at this. Spiritual teacher and author Ram Dass, who wrote Be Here Now, Ram Dass said, "A word talking about God is very much like a finger pointing at the moon. It's not the moon, it's just a finger." He goes on, 1,000 names exist just in Vishnu Hinduism and 99 in Islam. Those many names, 1,099 for God, and all of these different names are just names of the unnameable. Each name represents a different facet of God, and when you put them all together, they still don't represent the totality. It's not something that can be conceptualized. God, he says, is not a concept. God is beyond concept. Concepts just point in the direction. God is the edge where the form and the formless meet. Ram Dass's words are why I refer to daydreams rather than concepts of God today. Again, a long-winded way of saying God is not God's name. But I know that just even that word, that name God, can be a real turnoff. I get that. It does have, I will concede, a very anthropomorphic sound to it. When we say God and then use the pronoun he or even she, or better yet, the pronoun they, we're implying still that God is a being, much like us. And that's the classic Judeo-Christian daydream about God. We are created in God's image, and you can learn about the Creator by studying the creation, particularly its most glorious earthly characters, human beings. So in this daydream, God isn't a human being, but God is a being, even the supreme being. That's daydream number 2 about God. I'm guessing that's a daydream about God that doesn't work that well for a lot of us. I'm guessing that at least some of you are in a UU congregation today in part to get away from a highly anthropomorphic way of thinking about the divine. And I will say that this way of thinking about God, or daydreaming about God, has never really appealed to me intellectually. It was very easy to debate against this view of God in college, right? Or at least until God answered the phone. But really, this vision of God implies that God has a personality, which begs lots of questions like why this wonderful being would let us suffer, for one. So it's problematic to think of God as having a personality. But before I dismiss this daydream about God completely, I have to say, this is a daydream about God that I often inexplicably and even embarrassingly find myself daydreaming about and praying to in times of trouble. This is the daydream about God that often gave people the most comfort when I was serving as a healthcare chaplain, when they were suffering or approaching death. You can dismiss it, and I get that. But for me, this daydream about God still has a place. It's hard to feel the loving embrace of the collective unconscious, or the loving embrace of the interdependent web. That was our first daydream. But when God is even momentarily pictured as a supreme being, or a supreme mother or father spirit, or the supreme they, there's some real comfort there. For those of us who can, on occasion, access this daydream about God, there can be an enormous reward. It can be an emotional reward big enough to make up for the intellectual embarrassment we might feel. So there, I've outed myself as someone who occasionally daydreams about God as some sort of supreme being. In his sermon, Reverend Steve talked about the religious impulse. Steve said, "I found that while I could discard certain beliefs that no longer sustained me, or even made a lot of sense, I could not shake off religion or the religious impulse." Again, I feel that Steve and I arrived at a similar place coming from different paths. For me, the religious impulse, in a pretty traditional way, was always there deep in me, even though I never heard my parents pray. I found myself as a child lying in bed at night, secretly having conversations with what I supposed must be God. I didn't exactly believe in God, not intellectually, but on some visceral, emotional level, I wanted to feel connected to the universe. I wanted to feel connected to the ultimate mystery, and it felt so comforting to talk to it or talk at it, whether it was listening or not. But then again, of course it's listening, just in its own mysterious way. Let's get to a third daydream about God. This would be God as synonymous with nature. It's like a quotation by the renowned architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who was another Unitarian. Frank Lloyd Wright said, "I believe in God, only I spell it Nature." This is a kind of pantheism, I suppose. The dictionary defines pantheism as the doctrine that God is the transcendent reality of which the material universe and human beings are only manifestations. It involves a denial of God's personality and expresses a tendency to identify God and nature. The advantage of this daydream about God is it never flies in the face of science. It doesn't have any embarrassing supernaturalism to it, by definition. It's actually a very hard definition or view of God to debate against. One of its few disadvantages, really, is that it's barely a daydream at all. And in its own way, it's sort of confining. Why limit God to only what we, with our relatively limited brains, can see and study, when the best thing about an image of the divine might be that it has the potential to get at the big mysteries? Perhaps a somewhat more liberating daydream about God, my fourth and last daydream to share this morning, is panentheism. That's panentheism, not pantheism. What's the difference? Panentheism is a vision that God is essentially synonymous with the material universe, like pantheism, but also something that transcends the material universe and the natural world. When asked for my theology, depending on my mood, I will often say I'm a panentheist. The best thing about this daydream about God is that it lets you have your cake and eat it too. Why be dualistic and say that God is either the universe and the natural world, or some sort of supernatural being or supernatural force, when you can be dialectical and say that God is both the universe itself and something more that cannot really be put into words? Panentheism allows me to hold my seemingly contradictory daydreams about God. That God is a loving mother when I need comfort. That God is the interdependent web and connecting principle. And God is the universe and the laws of the universe too. With this daydream, the spark of divinity is found in everyone and everything. It fits pretty nicely with our transcendentalist forebears. When I look up at the night sky and see the stars, that's the divine. A baby, that's the divine. When I see you caring for each other so lovingly, that's the divine. When something wonderful and synchronistic happens, I experience the divine. And when something terrifying happens, that is the divine too. It reminds me of the short story called Teddy by J.D. Salinger. The main character is a precocious young boy named Teddy who says, "When I was 6, I saw that everything was God and my hair stood up." Teddy goes on, "It was on a Sunday, I remember. My sister was only a very tiny child then, and she was drinking her milk. And all of a sudden I saw that she was God and the milk was God. I mean, all she was doing was pouring God into God, if you know what I mean. So for me, God is not God's name. And it's as though everything is God pouring God into God, if you know what I mean." So those are just a few possible daydreams about God. There are so many more. I hope that you will, over time, share your own daydreams about God with me, maybe with each other. But daydreams still leave us with the question of, who cares? I mean, let's agree, for the sake of argument, that it's true that there's no such thing as atheism, and let's agree for the sake of argument that God exists, and it's just a question of semantics and how you might define God or the ultimate mystery or what have you. If we're going to just sit around taking intuitive guesses as to what God is like, what's the point? I mean, what is God good for? What good is God? Why waste time daydreaming about it? In his earlier years, when he was a Unitarian minister, future transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "A person will worship something. Have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will dominate our lives and character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming." Emerson. In closing, I want to suggest that in some ways this is the most practically important aspect of our musings about God. Whatever your daydreams of God might be, the more pointed question might be, what do you worship? The great 20th century theologian Paul Tillich described the object of our worship, this God, as our ultimate concern. For Tillich, whatever your ultimate concern is, that's what you worship. That's your God. This would be another argument for there being no atheists. Everyone has an ultimate concern, whether they like the word God or not. But if we think of God as our ultimate concern, it takes us to some interesting places. So I ask, what do you worship, really? Is your ultimate concern connection? Connection with others? Connection to nature? Is your ultimate concern love? Is your ultimate concern peace? Is your ultimate concern the earth? Is your ultimate concern knowledge and science? Are you sitting there afraid that your ultimate concern is something more shallow than any of that? Remember, what you are worshiping, you are becoming. Choose carefully, choose wisely. Blessed be, and amen.